So I'm summarizing the two articles we read by Usama ibn Munqidh, who was a warrior, diplomat, and poet. Now, he was from the 12th century, born July 4th, 1095, and died November 17th, 1188. Lived to 93 years old, which was pretty amazing for back then. He's best known as a poet, but he was born to an elite family in the town of Crusaders, how that's pronounced it, in Syria. Now, he was a diplomat and a warrior, but he kept getting kicked out of the courts that he worked in because he was interfering in politics. And because of that, he did really extensive travel. Now, his best-known works are The Book of the Staff, Kernels of Refinement, Dwellings and Abodes, and then a collection of his own poetry. But what we are reading from, I believe, is the Book of Learning by Example. And this contains his descriptions of the Crusades. And what I found fascinating, but especially after reading about how Pope Urban II had described all the Arabs as evil, wicked, cruel, inhumane people, here's this Arab who's describing many of the Crusaders as his friends. Now, the readings are just a series of stories about the Crusaders, whom he refers to as the Franks. Now, the general categories of the stories are the Magolno stories, that's the siege machine that would throw rocks. The defense of Damascus, there's a lot of stories about battles, the heroic deeds of women, all kinds of stories about people being betrayed, tales of friendship. Very interesting stories about Frankish medicine, stories about liberal ideas of the Franks about their women. Apparently, the Franks did not control their women quite the way the Arabs did. And then a couple stories about Frankish judgment. Let's take a look at one of the stories specifically. Now, the Franks had broken through the defenses, and the Muslims had to fight hand to hand to remove the Franks from the fortress. Now, an old man had come to warn them. They broke in, they had the fight, and they returned to their positions, where this following story occurs. I remained alone with the old man who had raised the alarm. He stood up and turned his face to the wall in order to pass water. So I turned away from him, but I soon heard the crash of a fall. I looked around, and behold, a magnolia stone had hit him in the head of the old man, crushed it, and stuck it to the wall, making the brains flow on the wall. I carried him away, and after conducting the funeral service, we buried him in his place. May Allah's mercy rest upon his soul. Let's take a look at another story. This is a story about his friend. In the army of King Fulk, son of Fulk, was a Frankish reverend knight who had just arrived from the land in order to make holy pilgrimage and then return home. He was of my intimate fellowship and kept such constant company with me that he began to call me my brother. Between us were mutual bonds of amity and friendship. When he resolved to return by sea to his homeland, he said to me, "My brother, I am leaving for my country, and I want thee to send me with me thy son," my son, who was then 14 years old and was at that time in my company, "to our country, where he may see the knights and learn wisdom and chivalry. When he returns, he will be like a wise man." Thus there fell upon my ears words which would never come out of my head of a sensible man. For even if my son were to be taken captive, his captivity could not bring him a worse misfortune than carrying him into the lands of the Franks. However, I said to the man, "By thy life, this has exactly been my idea. But the only thing that prevented me from carrying it out was the fact that this grandmother, my mother, is so fond of him and did not this time let him come out with me until she extracted an oath from me to the effect that I would return him to her." Thereupon he asked, "Is thy mother still alive?" "Yes," I replied. "Well," he said, "disobey her not." This is such an interesting perspective of there's humans. They're talking to each other and living together as people with common interests. They're not the evil enemy. Let's look at some common themes. It's interesting. When anyone alive is mentioned, he is blessed with "May Allah be praised." When anyone deceased is mentioned, he is blessed with "May Allah's mercy rest upon his soul." And any time a Frank is mentioned, other than when they're talking about friends, that may he be cursed by Allah. And in one story, the Franks and Muslims are slaughtering each other. And in the next story, they're living together and can be friends with each other. And then it makes them very interesting about the Franks that just moved there. They're particularly brutish and savage until they've had time to live in the Muslim country and be civilized. interesting concept. And then there's lots of deals made besides the brutal battles. There's negotiations and businesses being done. Very interesting. So in summary, this paints an entirely different picture than what is usually presented. I mean, Pope Urban talked about the Muslims as if they were just subhuman animals. And there's a much friendly and productive interaction between the Crusaders and the Muslims. I mean, their doctors learned from each other. Many of them were close friends. The Christian pilgrims were still traveling in the Middle East at the time of the Crusades, and there's commercial trade going on. I mean, the warfare was brutal. It was unforgiving, but these are basically people. Some of them are enemies, some of them are friends. It gives a much more humane picture to the Crusades than what we're usually taught.